Hi, everyone. Um, I'm recording these notes for the benefit of anyone who's trying to work through the defense mechanisms exercises online at home. I actually don't have plans to lecture on this material in class, but because some people complete these exercises usually in class time, I'd be available to ask and answer questions for people. And I realize it can be kind of a barrier if people are trying to do these on their own where they don't exactly have an opportunity to ask questions in real time. The thing I'm going to take you through quickly is different types of Freudian defense mechanisms. There's a bunch of them, and the big challenge is they're all kind of longish looking words. A bunch of them start with the letter R, and being able to distinguish exactly how it is that that thing defends against vulnerability and ego-threatening, harmful kinds of thoughts is going to be important, but difficult to do because all of them do it in kind of a different way. So first up, if we're just talking about what defense mechanisms are, period, in the way that a Freudian or psychoanalyst would think of them, their role is to defend the ego, the conscious self or conscious mind, from potentially threatening information. So this could be threatening information about your own lack of ability, maybe not being as good at something as you thought you were, painful realizations about the nature of your relationships or whether or not one is loved. I mean, these kinds of things can be kind of dark, but you're actually going to be applying them, hopefully to a light example as you do your cartoons exercise. And some of you I know have already started on that and we'll be working on it today. But so to help you understand exactly where we are in the context of Freudian theory here, remember Freud believed that the bulk of mental life was unconscious to us, and it was only a small portion of human mental life that was conscious. But the stuff that was in the unconscious kind of ugly and gross, like lots of unacceptable urges and impulses, and it would become too alarming for people to handle if this stuff became conscious to us. So the idea of defense mechanisms is they operate right here. See where it says protected information? The idea is that the ego or the conscious part of the mind has to proactively defend against stuff that's kind of gross, stuff that we don't want to admit about ourselves, especially our own shortcomings or maybe like unacceptable urges that we might be having. So we've got a number of ways that we could defend against that stuff. And for any particular ego-threatening idea, it's possible for us to use any single defense mechanism to do that. And sometimes students get confused about that in reading in their text because they'll read about a scenario and that's the example of the denial, or this is a scenario that shows what rationalization is, and they start to think that certain situations are like perfectly suited to some defense mechanisms and not others, when really the idea is that any single one of these things could help defend against a threatening self-realization. So we'll start with repression, which actually isn't even on your cartoons exercise. It does show up in some of the other exercises you'll be doing. But repression is one that we're a little familiar with because it showed up in our cognition unit. This is the idea that if we have memories of trauma or stuff that's maybe super threatening to us, that we just push those out of our conscious mind, and it's going to look like forgetting, because if we're asked about them later, we'll be like, oh, I have no idea. What do you mean? I don't remember that happening. And remember, the research on repression isn't super strong. Like, there's not a lot of evidence that this actually happens on a large scale, certainly not in response to trauma. So careful with it. And that also should make us cautious here too, because like Freud kind of believes that repression underlies most of the other defense mechanisms. I mean, that's how we're able to convince ourselves that of these untruths. Um, could repression happen sometimes to people? Like, yeah, probably. But is it something normative that happens to everybody, which is what he's arguing in his model of psychosexual development? Maybe not. Okay, so to give you a concrete example of each of these, which is helpful, we're going to work through this example that I had shared with some classes several years ago. It involves a couple of students of mine, actually. So we're going to go through the scenario where, like, okay, you know, Brian challenges Dylan to a dance off, and sadly, oh, my light just went out. Sorry, hold on. Oh, that's going to be unhelpful. Okay. Sorry, I think the light bulb just burnt out on one of my other lights, so I hope it's not super distracting and that you can see me okay. Anywho, so in the scenario, Brian has challenged Dylan to a dance-off and he loses. Ah, like, how will he cope with this now horrible reality that he's not as good of a dancer that he thought he was? Well, if you're using repression, you just forget about it entirely. If someone asked Brian about the dance-off, he's going to be like, what dance-off? I don't remember that. He could also revert to denial. Denial is a pretty straightforward defense mechanism wherein people just kind of refuse to accept reality as it is. And sadly, this does happen sometimes when people are threatened with like overwhelming grief. Sometimes people do go through a period where they kind of fail to accept the reality before them. Like if they're informed of the sudden loss of a loved one, there might be some time where they're like, no, that's got to be a mistake. I don't believe that that person is actually gone because they're not maybe ready to process it yet. So for a dance off, if that's the ego threatening reality that you're dealing with, you might question the score. You might say, no, I didn't lose. That's not possible because you're trying not to accept this thing that might be actually quite threatening to you. Now, displacement is another option as a defense mechanism. It's something that people are inclined to do when they're experiencing some uncomfortable emotion, like anger is a typical one, could be inappropriate like attractions too, like there's maybe potential for displacing those things, because what's happening is you redirect the feeling from its original target, which is unacceptable or maybe inappropriate or impossible to access, and instead take that same feeling out on somebody else. So if someone loses a dance-off, maybe although they're mad at their opponent, maybe, Brian doesn't want to appear unsportsmanlike, so he can't yell at his opponent. Instead, he ends up being short with his best friend. Maybe he's like mean to his own pets when he comes home. Some of you may recognize that this may be something we're inclined to do if we have a bad day at school or at work. Like things did not go as we planned. We're really angry. We can't take it out on the teacher, colleague, or coworker that made us angry. So instead, we end up being really short with our own family members. We take it out on our siblings, our parents, spouses, even though they're not the real source of the problem, but they feel the brunt of our anger. Any kind of like physical aggression where you're doing something like punching or hitting something tends to be displacement-y. So if you strike out playing baseball and throw the bat, like that's a displacement thing. It's not the bat's fault. You're not angry at the bat, but the bat is the thing that's feeling the brunt of the anger. So displacement of the feeling, not toward its original target, but something else. The idea is that it allows you to maybe hide the true source of the anger. So maybe you actually aren't aware of the real source of the anger in doing so. Like you claim that you're upset with your spouse when really it's something much deeper about work that's bothering you that you're failing to acknowledge. Now, regression is kind of an interesting one. This is something that's most likely to occur for young children, but it's also possible for adults to do in various ways, just maybe harder to spot. But to regress literally means to go backwards in someone's development. So to revert to an earlier developmental stage and to the comforting behaviors of that stage. So a typical, though maybe unlikely example, like for a high school student who has lost a dance-off, maybe Brian loses this dance-off, and then, to comfort himself, he returns to thumb sucking, which would be an oral development kind of thing. So if you think back to Freud's like psychosexual stages, that would be a comforting behavior from infancy. That he should be beyond that maybe as a teenager, or seeking mom's attention when you maybe should have long outgrown that. Just reverting back to childish behaviors like temper tantrum throwing and stuff like that. That's a defense mechanism as well. Like it's a way of seeking comfort in a way that like avoids the problem and conscious coping with it, but some sort of earlier phase of comfort that you can distract yourself with. Now, reaction formation, also a kind of interesting one. And this is one that I sometimes see students struggle to remember what it is. So maybe mnemonics would be helpful here. But reaction formation is when someone outwardly expresses the opposite of what they truly and unconsciously feel. And I think it's important to recognize that reaction formation in the true Freudian sense of it is not believed to be lying. Like, so the person's not consciously just trying to pretend that they feel okay when they don't in order to like save face or keep other people happy. They're even lying to themselves. They're pretending to themselves that they feel okay about something that maybe they really don't feel okay about. So for example, okay, so Brian loses the dance off and he says, well, that's great. I'm so glad Dylan won. When really, like, if this is important to you, how could you be happy that someone else won? He might actually be really upset that Dylan won. And he's just expressing the opposite here, but also trying to convince himself that he feels happy about this. Yeah, so anytime someone's trying to like adopt an emotion that's really counter to their true unconscious stuff would be a reaction formation. Like maybe, for example, tomorrow, like, well, should we actually have a snow day? I might be kind of upset about that, but if I pretend like, yay, another snow day, to try and convince myself that I'm happy about it, when truly I'm not, that'd be a reaction formation. So reaction formation, opposite. Some people use the mnemonic, they maybe have remembered about Newton's laws, with every action having an equal and opposite reaction. This is about an opposite reaction, this defense mechanism. Now, one that I think you get to witness a lot in other people, so now that you become aware of what it is, you might look for it, is projection. Projection is when people are able to hide how they're truly feeling by just attributing that feeling to others. Meaning, instead of acknowledging this is an idea or a belief or feeling they have maybe about themselves, they just claim that other people hold that feeling or have that urge. So maybe, Brian really hates Dylan for beating him in the dance-off. But instead of acknowledging that he hates Dylan, he'll say, look, Dylan hates me. Or maybe he deeply feels that he deserved to win. And so he'll start saying, oh, you can tell all the audience members, they really thought I should win. When really, those are his ideas. So anytime you see someone kind of ascribing something that they actually feel to somebody else, this might be a way of hiding that the feeling belongs to them. And of course, it's one of our Freudian defense mechanisms. Rationalization is one that, some of these defense mechanisms have more support in the research literature than other ones do. Rationalization actually has some strong empirical support, and there's actually other cognitive models that explain why it is that we do this. But rationalization is when we're faced with some ego-threatening reality, and we come up with some explanation about why that happened that usually absolves ourselves of blame. So it makes it look like it wasn't really our fault, it was other stuff. So we can feel better about ourselves. So you sometimes do see competitive athletes, like in dance-offs, use this kind of explanation, like, oh, I would have won if my bad knee hadn't acted up. Like, all right, or blaming something on the refs, like saying that the officials were terrible, and that's the reason that you had lost that game. And it wasn't, that hides the fact that it might have been you underperforming relative to your own expectations. Or maybe you're saying like, oh, my moves were definitely too innovative and awesome for the judges to appreciate, and therefore they're docking me points. I'm really just too good for this. Or someone, my favorite one of these is like, people experiencing a breakup might say that, that other person just couldn't handle how awesome I am. Like, that's really self-affirming. That's a nice explanation. But does anyone ever break up for that reason? Like, you're just too good. Like, that's seems implausible, and thus, perhaps a defense mechanism, right? Now, rationalization, like, could reasonably, like, it may or may not be helpful. Like, clearly it's hiding the true reason. So like maybe you're failing to accept blame. But there are ways where rationalization can maybe like ease the wound and maybe helpful for people. Sublimation, I think, arguably is a defense mechanism that some people see as potentially positive, where people find a positive outlet for some uncomfortable or negative feelings that's pro-social. So they might have some sort of need or urge that's kind of unacceptable. But then they find some other way to meet that need that's not socially unacceptable. So for example, maybe someone who gets beat in a dance off decides that, what their urge is, they want to best or better this person. They want to beat them in some way. So then they focus all their energy on like preparing for their next AP psychology quiz or test so that they can do better than that person. Well, that might actually help you do better in AP psychology. So thumbs up. Or like maybe the person is super like violent and aggressive, has a lot of like aggressive kind of Thanatos based, id tendencies. Maybe they find satisfaction of those things by playing super aggressively on the basketball court or in a football game where you could literally physically push someone without it violating the rules. And that would be a sublimation of the urge. You're finding some other outlet for it that might actually be positive. And I would point out here too that sublimation, I have people often confuse it with displacement, because both of those things involve like a redirection of energy. One of the key differences is that displacement is when you take out this energy or impulse on some other target that maybe is not socially acceptable. So you're yelling at your spouse instead of the boss who you're really angry at, and that's where the hiding happens. In sublimation, the target or outlet actually is socially acceptable. So you find some other way that might actually be positive or adaptive for meeting that need. So displacement, almost always negative. Sublimation can have some positive effects. I mean, obviously, it also has the negative impact of hiding maybe our true feelings. And that makes all defense mechanisms kind of by default somewhat problematic. So there's a last one here, which I didn't include on the worksheet exercise, and sometimes I exclude when we're short for time, but why not? Here's a bonus. Intellectualization is a special kind of sublimation. So it's a unique type of defense mechanism where people intellectualize a problem. So instead of dealing with the emotional content, which may be really difficult, they approach it in sort of a removed academic way. So for example, someone loses a dance-off and maybe they study kinesiology, which is, the academic study of body and muscle movements, so they can become experts in body movement, or study the history of dance. That kind of allows them to get at some need that they had to master this area of their life, but in a way that really makes it kind of intellectual and academic. And certainly there are some folks who in their academic careers have been driven by this, like lots of PhDs and writers in different fields might have been spurred to study a topic after having experienced some distress or problem in that area themselves. So this is their way of like approaching it in a healthy way to understand it better. So again, like maybe not overly problematic. It may have some positive impacts for people. So that's it for our tour of the defense mechanisms. I hope this has been helpful if you're struggling with them to understand what they mean. And I can't wait to see the cartoons that you come up with.